Wel, croeso cynnes i chi gyd i'r webinar hon heno. Enw i yw Elinor Gwyn a fi fydd yn hwyluso'r sesiwn dros yr awr a hanner nesaf. A warm welcome to you all to this webinar tonight. My name is Elinor Gwyn and I'll be facilitating the session over the next hour and a half. Now, given the topic of tonight's webinar, we thought it appropriate to provide opportunities for speakers and participants to hear and use the Welsh language. We'll have a mix of Welsh and English throughout the session. Felly, unwaith eto, diolch i chi am ymuno ni ar gyfer y drydedd webinar yn y gyfres o sesiynau sydd wedi trefnu gan brosiect Natur am Byth, mwyn ystyried sut i hyrwyddo cyfranogiad ac amrywiaeth o fewn sector yr ymgylchedd. Heno, byddwn yn trafod sut i ddathlu'r Gymraeg ac ymdeimlad o le ym maes cadwraeth a rheolaeth amgylcheddol. O ran trefn y noswaith, mi fyddai'n hwyluso gyda chymorth Fresh Productions a staff Natur am Byth yn y cefndir. Dwi am ddechrau gyda chydig o wybodaeth gyffredinol a thamed o gyflwyniad go sydyn i'm diddordeb i yn y maes hwn. A wedyn, cawn glywed gan ein siaradwyr gwadd arbennig Carol Owen a Carwyn Graves. Bydd sesiwn holi ac ateb ar ôl bob un o'r ddwy sgwrs, yna sesiwn holi ac ateb chydig yn hwy ar ddiwedd y webinar. Sleid nesaf, Christy. Next slide. Gallwch bostio sylwadau yn y blwch sgwrsio neu'r bocs chat unrhyw bryd yn ystod y webinar. Gallwch wneud hyn yn Gymraeg neu yn Saesneg. Bydd sylwadau Cymraeg yn cael eu cyfieithu yn y cefndir. Defnyddiwch y blwch Q&A drwy'r webinar. Unwaith eto, fel yn achos y sylwadau, gallwch holi yn Gymraeg neu yn Saesneg a bydd y cwestiynau Cymraeg yn cael eu cyfieithu. Wedyn, cliciwch ar y symbol bawd i fyny os ydych chi'n cytuno efo cwestiwn. Os byddwn ni'n brin o amser ar y diwedd, fe newn ni drio taclo'r cwestiynau gyda'r mwyaf o ddodi ei fyny. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own involvement with the field. So in all these webinars, as facilitators, we have an opportunity to share just a little about our own interest in the topic and the discussion. So before we hear from Carwyn and Carol, who are the stars of the show tonight, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about some of the activities I've been involved with over the years. So my interest in the three topics we're looking at tonight, the environment, sense of place and language, particularly the Welsh language, goes back to childhood. It's a lifelong interest, to be honest, and it's had a profound influence on my life and continues to do so. So I put together this slide of images rather than bullet points to act as an aide-memoir, really, to remind me of the things I wanted to mention as examples of my own activities that reflect this interest of mine. The activities fall broadly into 5 categories with quite a bit of overlap between them. So I'm going to just canter through them, really. But starting from the top left, we begin with the first category, which is kind of, well, I describe the category as words, names, and vocabularies, represented by the first 2 slides or the 2 images. So from a young age, I was passionate about roaming through dictionaries, collecting old glossaries, collecting local names for wildlife, habitats, practices, customs relating to land management. And over the years, I've also become involved with standardizing Welsh names for species, currently working on seaweeds, mosses and liverworts, and some of the Natur am Byth species. And I also have the same fascination with place names, collecting, investigating, discussing. Then the second category of activity includes writing in Welsh, whether that's factual, as in the case of an article about this old 18th century map of the coast of Anglesey, which is the 3rd image across on the top line, or a recent book review about the antiquarian, traveller, polymath Thomas Pennant, whose personal artist created the image of this lone tree near Clynog in the top right-hand corner. Or creative writing, moving down to the second line on the left, like this little set of poems written in response to the NRW peatland restoration work in the Tywi Forest. And then translating as well as editing millions of words in this category. I wouldn't like to think how many millions of words I've translated over the years, from descriptions of designated sites to articles, press releases, posters, and social media posts. But to get opportunities for more creative translation is a wonderful thing, such as commissioning poems instead of straightforward translations, as in the case of this Dathlu'r handbook for the National Trust. Then moving along the second line, the third category is around collaborating and celebrating, although everything involves a degree of collaboration and celebrating, I have to say. But this category here is represented by a project that involved collecting environmental words from different minority languages and commissioning writers to respond to them. Then next to collaboration, I'm working with at the moment with an Irish printmaker and a Welsh triple harpist, responding to C words that are the same in Welsh and Irish. And then last image on the midline there is around developing a new festival in North Wales that aims to share and celebrate our varied connections with the environment, mainly through the medium of Welsh. And then down to the bottom line, the fourth category is training, including things such as developing novel approaches and materials for Welsh language awareness training courses, piloting a Welsh in the landscape course for non-Welsh speaking staff and volunteers within the sector, and I know we'll hear more about that from Carol. And then a similar course in North Wales for Welsh speakers, learners, and also outdoor activity leaders, and then developing bespoke materials for these courses to help new Welsh speakers become familiar with and pronounce words for habitats and species. And finally, the last image in the bottom corner, right-hand side of the slide, is drawn from a recent research project around eco-linguistics, which I undertook, and where I explored the interweaving of language, landscape, and environment, and how this activity and interweaving features in people's everyday lives. And now I'm just about to start on a new research project exploring medical herbalism in Wales, where again, I know the Welsh language will feature prominently as I interrogate and try and make sense of a raft of archives held in various places, both within Wales and beyond. So that's enough about my interest in the field. We'll move on to the next slide. I'm not sure which slide is coming next, but if we can look at the next one. Okay, so it's this one. Right. Right, I'm just going to go back to Welsh for this one. A dwi'n mynd I roi ychydig mwy o wybodaeth am y gyfres hon o webinarau amrywiol wrth natur. Lle mae natur am byth fel rhaglen yn awyddus I sicrhau bod rhagor o bobl o wahanol gefndiroedd, galluoedd, oedran, abledd, rhywedd ag ati yn gallu dod I gysylltiad â byd natur. Ac mwyn cyflawni hyn, mae wir yn bwysig yn bod ni'n penodi pobl o bob math I swyddi amgylcheddol a chadwreithol. A rydyn ni'n gobeithio felly y bydd y gwebinarau hyn yn helpu natur am byth I gyrraedd ei nod drwy feithrin y teimlad bod yna ymrwymiad dofn I gynyddu cynrychiolaeth a chynhwysiant. A thrwy ddyfnhau ein dealltwriaeth o bersbectifs gwahanol, a thrwy helpu rhagor o bobl wedyn I weld lle iddyn nhw eu hunain o fewn y sector. Slide nesaf, next slide, Christy, please. Mae 5 webinar yn y gyfres, pob un yn archwilio thema wahanol o ran amrywiaeth o fewn y sector cadwraeth ac amgylchedd. Felly, amrywiaeth o ran hil, cynhwysiant o safbwynt anabledd, dathlu'r Gymraeg ar ymdeimlad o le, sef heno. Wedyn i ddod dathlu cynhwysiant LHDT+, a nolaf dathlu niwroamrywiaeth. Felly hon yw'r drydedd webinar, ond gallwch wrando nôl ar y ddwy sydd wedi cael eu cynnal yn barod. Sleid nesaf, next slide please, Christy. Reit, dyma droi felly at ein siaradwyr gwadd arbennig heno. Ac i ddechrau, gai gyflwyno Carwyn Graves. Mae Carwyn yn byw gyda'i deulu yn Sir Gaerfyrddin o hyd, dwi'n meddwl, Carwyn, dwi'n gwybod bod chi newydd symud tŷ yn ddiweddar. Mae Carwyn yn gweithio gydag undeb y bydyddwyr o ddydd i ddydd, ond rydyn ni'n ei nabod e hefyd fel hanesydd ac ymgyrchydd bwyd ac fel awdur. Mae Carwyn am gychwyn i gyflwyniad gydag ychydig o Gymraeg a wedyn idde'n troi i'r Saesneg. Felly croeso Carwyn a ni'n edrych ymlaen yn fawr i glywed dy sgwrs di.
Diolch yn fawr, Eleanor, a diolch i bawb am y croeso fel petai i'r stafell ddigidol hon. Fe ges i gais i siarad yn bennaf yn Saesneg heno, ac felly mi fyddai'n troi at y Saesneg mewn munud. Dwi'n cymryd hefyd bod nid yn yma yn Gymru Cymraeg iaith cynta, neu'n rhugol eu Cymraeg, ond hefyd bod yna nifer fawr yn ein plith ni heno sydd ddim yn siarad Cymraeg. Felly dwi'n ymwybodol o hynny wrth i ni fynd i'r afel a hyn. Felly dyma fi ar fi'n troi nawr at y Saesneg. So I'm going to switch and continue the rest of it in English because I was asked to do so. And to say, and maybe it's appropriate actually to talk about the topic of the Welsh language in a different language because we'll be seeing as it as it were from the outside. And I am aware, as I was thinking about this, I am aware that many people who work or are deeply involved in nature conservation and so on, whatever term we want to use, don't tend to have much of a background in language. That's maybe a generalization, but I think there's probably something in that. Many obviously trained in the sciences and so on. So unapologetically, I'm going to take those kind of linguistic lenses on things, and hopefully it'll become clear as we go through why I've done that. And the big idea, I'll say a little bit more just about my standpoint coming into all of this in a moment. But the big idea in everything we're about to go through over the next 25 minutes or so is that language, and specifically, of course, in our case, the Welsh language, does provide a unique way of understanding the world. Now, maybe that sounds like a completely non-controversial, obvious thing to say, but I think often when we talk about language in English, the tendency is to say language is a way of labeling things. There's an English word for something and a Welsh word for something. Language is a label. That's fine, it's not untrue, but there's a lot more that needs to be said to get under the skin of that. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. What does that mean when we talk about nature in Wales, and specifically the Welsh language? If we move to the next slide, a few slides just rapidly. Who am I to talk about any of this? Well, not an expert by any means on anything, other than perhaps heritage apple varieties. That was a book I had great pleasure in writing, still available. Ask me about apples another time. We move on. Yes, food history. This is a broad mass market kind of introduction, in a sense, to the history of food in Wales. I'm working on something much more substantial at the moment, the history of Welsh food. Believe it or not, no such thing has ever been done before. We move on, though, to, I'm very involved in day-to-day, as well as with the Baptist Union of Wales, with Cegin y Bobl, which is a food charity. We're quite young, but we're growing rapidly here in Southwest Wales. So there's a lot of links between nature and food, or there should be anyway. And we're working face-to-face with people on that. So moving on, just giving you a sense of who's talking to you. And then this book, yes, it's the story of the Welsh landscape, as the subtitle says, but I think it's fair to say it brings a strong linguistic lens to the Welsh landscape. At least that was my intention. And that book came out about 2 years ago. And the new one, if you move on to the next slide, takes things a lot further. This is not out yet. This is coming out in April now. But this is really the successor to Tir, titled Cynefin, and we'll come back to that word in a few moments. So moving on, again, that gives you a little bit of background, some of the things I've worked on and written on that are germane to this topic. And for now, spending most time on the first of these 3 points, but also looking at the other two, I'm going to just structure things in this way. Firstly, the idea of seeing our places and habitats in Wales, using that word cynefin, cynefinoedd, which we'll come back to, through a Welsh language lens. What does that mean? I talked about language as a label. That's fine. But what does it mean to actually see it through the lens of the language, rather than just looking at places and nature around us, using Welsh words, because they're not the same thing. So that's the first one. The second one then is language as culture. And what does that mean for conservation, for the natural world? And thirdly, language as an experience. And I guess I should say as a culture, as a way of life, as a frame for seeing things for many people in our country, including more than half the time myself. We live in Welsh. I'll come back to that and what that means, for some ideas as to what that means for the natural world. And then point 3, as an experience, there are many, many people in Wales, about 70% of the population, who don't speak Welsh. Or at least that's what they might say, depending on how you ask the question. There are very few people in Wales who don't speak any Welsh. Go to Gloucester, just over the border, ask the people there to count to 5 in Welsh, or what thank you is, and they have no idea whatsoever. Silly example, perhaps, but it makes the point, I think, that the language is an experience for everybody in Wales who has any kind of longevity here, wherever they come from originally in the world. And that's relevant to the topic tonight. So moving on to the next slide, and that first point, if we may. And I just want to get everybody here, before I say anything else. I've already implicitly acknowledged it. We've all got a relationship with the language. And I want you to think about that. What is your relationship with the Welsh language? Maybe it is the way that you live life day to day. Maybe it was your parents' or grandparents' language, but not your own. Maybe it was a language of education, but not your first language, not your mother tongue in any sense, your heart language, if you like. Or maybe it's something that some people that you know speak, but it's a bit of a mystery. Maybe it's something you're proud of, but couldn't say that you speak. Maybe it's something you find very difficult and annoying about living in Wales. And there are other valid answers too. I'm just going to give us 10 seconds. Maybe if you've got a phone or a piece of paper, maybe just write down, in a few words, what is your relationship with the language? Okay. There are, of course, no right or wrong answers here. But I guess as you were writing and thinking, we're all aware that there are other people on this call who will have put down very different answers. And as we look at that picture in front of us as well, obviously deliberately put there, that is a picture I took a couple of years ago, a valley in mid Wales, near quite a well-known place to some of you called Gilfach. And the river is Afon Marteg, a very storied river that means a lot in the history of that part of Wales. It could also be the Upper Rhondda Valley before the coal mines opened. I was using words there to describe that place. Let's move on to the next slide. We've all got relationships with the language. We've just been looking at a picture. I've said a few things about it, of a place in Wales. Let's come to this first point then. What does it mean to see our places and habitats through a Welsh language lens? And to start answering this, I want to briefly take you to Germany. Let's move on to the next slide. I don't know if you've seen this picture before. If you haven't, there's a high chance you've seen something somewhere by this artist. Das ist der berühmte Caspar David Friedrich, a well-known German romantic artist. You can see the dates of his life there. And the picture is emblematic of that period when kind of romantic nature was being discovered. The landscape, the sublime landscape in English in this period, you had people like William Wordsworth writing poems to beautiful places in the Lake District and in the Wye Valley also. And in this picture, what we have is a representation, an artistic representation, obviously, of a core concept in the relationship of German-speaking culture to the landscape. This word, der Urwald, it's a cultural concept long before any scientific theories. It's this idea of the primeval forest, deeply rooted in German culture. You can trace it through Wagner and the Ring of the Nibelungen and many other things beside savory and less savory as well. And implicit in the idea of the primeval forest, which the picture represents, is this idea that beyond the door, beyond the confines of the town and the confines of the fields, lies wilderness, wild nature, a deeply culturally embedded idea. If you're interested in it, I can highly recommend Simon Sharma's core work on this, a huge 1,000-page tome of a book on landscape and representation. Anyway, that's Germany 200 years ago. If we move on to the next slide, suddenly we're in Ceredigion 2 or 3 winters ago. And what this picture that I took, also this photograph is showing, is not Urwald, it's not primeval forest in any sense. It's a relatively unknown patch of Tros. And then, of course, the question comes, and I do apologize for those who have read Tyr, but we need to cover some of this ground. What is Tros in English? And since the 80s, the term Tros has been used in English in ecological writing about landscapes in Wales and indeed also in some other parts of the British Isles for Tros, wet pasture sometimes. That picture shows what you might struggle to define in English as maybe a poor, boggy field or something of that sort, poor land agriculturally, not necessarily from a wildlife point of view, but that's another story. And in Welsh, we have a term for it that is widely used in culture. There's a well-known current performing band, Cowboys, Tros Botunog from North Wales. It turns up in the Welsh translation of Silent Night, in one of the first lines, that Christmas carol, well known, and Night on the Horse. The carol, originating in Austria, of course, translated into Welsh and is contextualized immediately by use of the word Tros. What is that in English? We could say heath, but that takes us to the New Forest and to a very different sort of landscape, ecologically speaking, to this one. We could say moor, but that takes us to Yorkshire and to also very different landscapes. Highland, whereas Rhos is often lowland. Rhos is the word. If we move on to the next slide, we could give perhaps an even sharper example. Can we have the next slide, Christy? Mynydd. And again, a word that may be familiar to those of you with a knowledge or a fluent knowledge of Welsh. And I say to you, what is mynydd in English? And you say to me, well, mynydd is, of course, mountain. Well, that's good insofar as it goes. But the problem is that the word mountain in English immediately denotes land that is necessarily very much higher than any surrounding hills. A mountain always has a peak in English, whereas in Welsh, you've got many, many mynydd areas in Anglesey, some of which are not the highest part of even the surrounding parish or community. In Aberporth, there is a patch of Aberporth, I've put it on the slide, traditionally known as Mynydd Aberporth. It is a relatively low-lying part of the parish of Aberporth. In Cardiff, we have a large hospital known in English as Heath Hospital, colloquially, known in Welsh by many people as Mynydd Bychan. Heath, Mynydd Bychan. Before that area was urbanized, you could have stood where that hospital is and seen the much higher hills of Kincoed and the Wenallt, Cefn up to the north and to the east. The Mynydd Bychan is not even particularly prominent by the standards of local topography. In other words, the word mynydd in Welsh, though it also clearly translates well into mountain, in many cases, mountain would be an utterly inappropriate translation for it. You'd have to find another way of getting the toponym across in English. So the lens, do you remember that word I used a little while ago? The lens that the language uses for the landscape works according to its own understanding of the landscape, which is clearly, even just in the examples given, quite different to those used in English, and even more so from those used in, and I use German as an example of a relatively, a language and a culture relatively close by with lots of interaction with Welsh over the centuries, and yet different enough to make the point. The point being, having talked about Oerwald, the primeval forest, look in any of the Welsh cultural archive, by which I mean the myths, the poetry, sayings, folk songs, look for this idea of the dark forest, such as you find in the Brothers Grimm. The dark forest that is beyond the bounds of civilization, those wild places that we don't go to because they're full of monsters. They're there throughout German culture. They're simply not present in Welsh culture. The lenses, the cultural understanding of what place means is very, very different. So we move on to the next slide. Yes, and just to make the point perhaps even more clearly, I took a well-known German illustration. I pick perhaps a too well-known Welsh artist of the 20th century, Cyffin Williams, and a relatively prominent, well-known painting by the standards of these things that Cyffin painted. I believe this was in the 1980s, and widely reproduced, available in print and so on and so forth, called The Way to the Cottages, as a cultural representation of place, and indeed, I put it to you, of language. I'm not suggesting in any way that my selection is scientific, but put that next to Caspar David Friedrich. Look at the oeuvre of the two artists in the round, and ask the question, the tip of what iceberg are they representing? We're in a very, very different territory here with Cyffin, and a different understanding, therefore, of the place of people and of nature in the landscape than we were with Caspar David Friedrich. I let that stand, and you may disagree as you will, but I make that point. Let's move on. Yes, and give just a couple of other examples from a different cultural form where people have related to nature and the landscape within the mainstream of Welsh language culture. If we move on to the next slide, again, I wrote a fair bit about this in the new book that isn't out yet. This poem that you have in front of you is an englyn. This is in Cynghanedd. It's in a Welsh strict meter. Very strict rules as to how you write this. I like to say that an englyn, I mean, englyns have been written in Welsh for, in one form or another, over 1,000 years. They're very mainstream. When my daughter was born, a friend of ours who is a poet who's never been published, nobody knows about him, he writes englyns. He wrote one to celebrate her birth. This is normal. You find these on gravestones and so on and so forth. This poem, this englyn, was written by a, at the time, young poet in May 1990, Myrddin ap Dafydd, to commemorate the death of a local hedge layer called Cled. I translated it with Myrddin's full blessing. I'll read it out in the original and the translation. So the original says, "Yn hwf y draen, mae feder o, yn gwyni, yn gan wrth ei gofio. Hwyther cyll ymhlithau'r co, gan ei wen yn gwanwyno." And in translation, in my poor translation, "In the thorn's growth, his skill blossoms white into song as it remembers him, and woven the hazel rods still under his smile here spreading." So this idea in the poem that this hedge layer, having died young, an untimely death, that as the hedge that he laid comes into blossom in this particular spring, that it remembers him, it celebrates his life. A very common sort of idea in Welsh language poetry of this sort. I could have picked an example from generations before this, or a more recent one with no difficulty. This idea of the consonance, if you like, between people and the landscape, the cynefin from which they come and in which they live. We move on only because I think that the poem makes the point clearly enough. And I'll actually move on from this slide as well, even though there's much to be said there, and from this one too, because I am aware of time. Yeah, and before coming to the second subheading, all of those examples, the artworks, the different features of the landscape, horse, mynydd, and so on and so forth, the englyn as well. I was trying to start answering that question. What does it mean to see places and habitats through a Welsh language lens? And what I was trying to say with those examples, and if I had more time, I could open this up a lot more. But what I was trying to say with those examples is that as people involved in conservation, which I take it you are, if you're here this evening, I think that there is a meaningful way of relating to place, to habitats, to the natural world, using the Welsh landscape, using the Welsh language, and allowing it to frame how the language is understood. So rather than saying, rather than importing and mapping the landscape using terminology and frameworks that come from other cultures, because everything is cultural before it's scientific, using the frameworks that the culture here already provides. And I've provided just a few hints, and of course there are many, many more of the range and the breadth, and Eleanor's work I think gives many, many more of these as well, of the resources available within Welsh language culture that can help with this, be they poems, be they paintings, be they structures, be they sayings, be they many, many other things besides. So this, I guess the big idea is the thought world, if you like, that the language carries implicitly within it. That takes us on much more briefly to the second point. Let's go back one slide. This idea of the language as a culture. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because just a few quick points about what this means. It means that for people who speak Welsh every day, that is unthinkingly how everyday life is structured. I think that bears saying when I'm talking English. It gives people shared reference points. My wife is English from Berkshire. She learnt Welsh as an adult. She's fluent in Welsh. The thing that she finds hardest is in conversation with Welsh speakers is when they talk about shared reference points from within Welsh language culture, be they pop songs or sayings or in-jokes in the culture that she has no background of. She's completely fluent in the language, but she doesn't have those shared reference points. I would go further and say that the language quite clearly carries with it, or the language culture carries with it, a set of expectations that we Welsh speakers have. I'm allowed to say this, I'm the first language Welsh speaker. I think that Welsh speakers demonstrably, we tend to have a big chip on our shoulder and we tend to be very defensive of the language and culture. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement, and it's one I would be allowed to make. What are those expectations? How does that impact the landscape? Well, some of them are to do with the intergenerational nature of many aspects of the culture, the expectations around how you relate to neighbours and so on and so forth. Okay, that's the background, talking about language as a culture. If we move on to the next slide, what does this mean for nature conservation? Quite briefly, I'm not going to talk to all of these bullet points, work, home, and bro, or community and home patch, because of time. I'm actually going to refer briefly to a piece of research that was emailed to me yesterday that makes the point much more clearly. Done by Bangor University along with Cambridge University and others, an article in for peer review in a journal. It's entitled How a Minority Language Connects People with Nature, author Thora Tending at Bangor University. And it samples over 2,000 nationally representative adults across Wales. It's a strong piece of academic work. It will be peer reviewed and it will be published. I think when it is published, it will make the news headlines because it demonstrates with a large sample that Welsh speakers have a significantly stronger self-assessed connection to nature in general and attachment to place than English speakers in Wales. And this is a statistically robust finding. I'm pretty sure, having read widely in this literature, nothing of this sort has been attempted before, and it demonstrates what many of us would have said intuitively with some fairly hard social science data. Furthermore, the other major finding is that Welsh speakers tend to see a link between language and environment, and I'm happy to say that to a piece of academic research, with the difference between Welsh speakers and English speakers in Wales in this regard amounting to about 40%. So Welsh speakers at a rate of 40% greater see a link between language and environment. What does that mean? How do we understand that linguistically? Well, those are academic questions that need much more time than we have tonight. But I think those findings make the point very clearly. Language carries culture within it, and that has a demonstrable and measurable impact on the connection that people feel to both place and nature. That matters hugely to how people plan nature conservation projects in Wales. Finally, and to finish, also briefly, if we move on to the next slide, the language as an experience. If we go to the next slide again, Christy, I think this is the other way to get into this topic, and it needs saying, even if very briefly. And this is simply that, look, again, not to make things personal, but I think personal examples are always helpful. I have many friends here in Carmarthen, well, 4 families I know now, who have moved here from different countries in Africa, Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, since 2020. They don't speak Welsh. Their kids are in different schools in and around Carmarthen. For them now, the Welsh language is a part of their experience of life. And this matters hugely. I wouldn't want anything I was saying earlier to be taken to mean that there is an agenda around nature conservation using the Welsh language the frameworks that the Welsh language offers that therefore excludes others. It's demonstrably the case that the language is an experience, and it can be part of people's experience of the landscape that is open to everybody. And some of this is patently obvious, but probably worth saying anyway. Obviously, this is true when it comes to things like place names. What does Cnwcr Hydd mean? Well, it means the knoll of the what's the English term? The female deer. I've had to blank as to the term. Anyway, the knoll up in the hills. But what does that mean at a deeper level in terms of where those words come from, what it tells us about what used to be present in the landscape, the links into the culture of that area and so on and so forth. All those things are open to anybody. History. If I say the word Rhyd Cymerau and you're a first language Welsh speaker and you're educated in Welsh, chances are that word is freighted with connotations to you. And those connotations are to do with the history of a piece of Carmarthenshire landscape. If you don't speak Welsh, it's a name and you want to know more. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. Immediately, it's not just the name as a label, but history is right there. And the history of people and species together, that matters too, farming and nature. And thirdly, species. Glas y Dorlan. What is Glas y Dorlan? But also, what could Glas y Dorlan be, even for somebody who doesn't speak Welsh and is maybe never going to learn Welsh? It's kingfisher, by the way, but literally, it's the blue one of the waterside, the blue one of the waterside. Well, isn't that another way to understand the kingfisher, even in English? And we can have that sort of bilingual fun playing with words. So it's an experience for everybody. I appreciate that this is already what many of you do day to day. But I think that third point needs making to complement the other ones. I will thank you, Kirsty. We'll finish. I think there is a final slide. Oh yeah, I'm flogging my book. You can buy your book. Christmas is only however many days away, 330 days till next Christmas. So there you go. You can buy the book. But in all seriousness, I am looking forward to the comments and the questions and to Carol's talk. So without further ado, diolch yn fawr iawn.
Gwych iawn. Diolch, Carwyn. Digon I gnoi cil arno, plenty of food for thought, as always. Jack's working hard in the background. Do we have any questions or comments for Carwyn? Right, we have one here. Carwyn, do you think that an increased Welsh culture knowledge and language proficiency can help us to feel more connected to the Welsh landscape?
Yes, and I think that fascinating piece of academic research that I referenced a few minutes ago demonstrate that's true, that is true for a lot of people. And I think interestingly, it's true for those of us who are fluent in Welsh or first language speakers, just in a different way, but just as much as it is for people who don't speak Welsh fluently. This is all spectrum, and one of the things that's not unique, but certainly very true about Welsh is that there are depths and layers and layers and layers to the landscape, to the language, particularly when it comes to the realm of nature and the environment. What I mean is there are so many words for different species. There are different words for colours. There are different specific, maybe dialect words for elements of, what is a cliff and what are the elements of a cliff and what are the different bits of rocks. Things that even if you're an utterly fluent, say, educated Welsh speaker, there are specific words that you can learn, that you pick up. I'm learning new words in Welsh, and my Welsh doesn't lack for anything. I'm happy to say that. I have very good written Welsh. I can translate and everything, and yet, and I think any professional Welsh translator worth their salt would say the same thing. There's always more you can learn. So that there's a depth there, and particularly when it comes to the landscape. So yes, in so many ways.
I'm looking at the chat box here, so a few lovely comments here, including one from Thora Tenbrink, who you referenced in your talk, who says that learning Welsh has opened the door to a whole new world to me, or at least a culture. And a few people have added similar comments there.
Great. And I suppose one thing I am is a linguist. I do speak a number of other languages fluently, including some dead ones. And the reason I mentioned that, the value of that in returning to Wales in my case, has been to really see every language is unique. Every language, is genuinely a treasure. But not every language has the same degree of intricacy in the way that language or people group, culture, as it were, has chosen to relate to the landscape. So there are European minority languages where, for whatever reason, and these are difficult things to understand, but for whatever reason, they may live in the people group. I'm not going to mention them now, but there are people groups with speaking minority languages in the Alps and in Scandinavia and so on and so forth that will only use very generic terms for, say, a mountainous area or an upland area. And interestingly, that doesn't tend to be the case with Welsh. Welsh has tended to be very specific and actually have in many cases, a profusion. Although there are gaps in Welsh, fascinating ones, as Eleanor knows well. Welsh doesn't have historic names for things like different butterfly species or different moth species. Those terms simply didn't exist in Welsh 100 years ago, but it does for other things. And so that texture is in and of itself fascinating, and I think is one of the sort of ways that once you get to understand that and learn about it, I think it would make anybody feel more connected to their own country and landscape, in this case Wales.
Mm. Elizabeth Hancock's in the chat box makes the point about the importance of understanding Welsh for landscape scale nature recovery, as well as connecting her to a Welsh heritage, while Gethin makes a specific point, Gethin Davis praising the North Wales Wildlife Trust for changing the name of Spinneys to Llyn Celanedd recently. So do you want to respond to any of those 2 points, Carwyn? Anything strikes you about those comments?
Mostly just to agree, I think the landscape scale thing is interesting. One thing I wouldn't want is to suggest that because we have inherited such a wealth of terms and framings, if you like, for nature and for the landscape in Welsh and in Wales, that there's therefore no room for new terminology. And I think that's an interesting thing when we think about the future. We may end up, over the next few decades with entirely new species and entirely new ways of organizing the landscape. And how could we develop new ways of talking about that going with the grain of the Welsh landscape? Even, let's say, I'll just pick an example out of thin air, the relationship between bird species and wind turbines, a controversial area. What's that going to look like over the next 50 years? What words are we going to need to describe that? And what might that look like specifically in Wales? These are, none of this is just about looking backwards. It's about going with the grain of what we've inherited.
Lovely. Laura's asked a question specifically around availability of Welsh in the landscape courses. Perhaps we can take that question in the general chat at the end, because I think Carol's going to be talking a bit about that activity as well in her next talk. So no more questions specifically for Carwyn. I'm sure there'll be more at the end. So I'll switch to Welsh now to introduce Carol. Diolch eto Carwyn am y sgwrs wych. A draw ni nawr te at Carol Owen. Wedi nabod Carol ers blynyddoedd. Mae Carol yn byw gyda'i theulu yng Ngogledd Sir Benfro wrth odre'r Preseli. Mae hi wedi gweithio i Barc Cenedlaethol Arfordir Penfro ers blynyddoedd mawr, fel parcmon yn y rhan honno'r sir, a mae gwaith hi, fel y cewn ni glywed nawr, yn ymwneud gryn dipyn gyda phobl boed treini yn ymwelwyr, yn blant ysgol neu'n gymunedau lleol. Felly, drosodd at y ti, Carol. Next slide, please, Christine.
Gred. Diolch yn fawr Eleanor am y cyflwyniad, a diolch i Christy a Natur am byth am y gwahoddiad i siarad gyda chi heno. Felly fel wedodd Eleanor, enw fi yw Carol Owen, a dwi wedi bod yn gweithio fel parcmon gyda Parc Cenedlaethol Arfordir Penfro ers 28 mlynedd erbyn hyn. Sleid nesaf, please, Christy. Felly dwi'n gweithio yn rhan ogleddol y Parc Cenedlaethol, yr ardal Ore, wrth gwrs, yn fy marn i. I rai o'na chi sy'n gwybod yr ardal, mae hwn yn ymestyn o Drath Popit ar bwys Aberteifi yn y gogledd, lawr i Abergwein, ac yn cynnwys holl ardal Cwm Gwein a Mynydd Preseli draw i ffin dwyreiniol y parc ar bwys Crymych. Fel pob ardal o wledig o Gymru, yn enwedig, mae tipyn o mewnfudo wedi bod dros yn enwedig yr 20, felly 30 mlynedd diwetha, a tipyn o allfudo plant yn enwedig yn symud lan i Gaerdydd a llefydd i gael gwaith. A mae hynny wedi effeithio'r Gymreigdod rhai cymunedau sy'n dowt am hynny, yn enwedig y rei arfordirol. Ond hynny, mae fe dal yn ardal Gymreig iawn. A dim diwrnod yn paso o safbwynt fi heb o fi'n siarad yr iaith fel rhan o fy swydd. Nawr mae hyn yn hollol wahanol wrth gwrs lawr yn gwaelod y sir, yn rhan deheuol Sir Benfro a'r Parc Cenedlaethol lawr fyna, sydd wedi bod yn ardal Saesneg i iaith ers canrifodd. Mae tipyn fwy o Gymraeg i gael ar gwylod y sir dyddiau yma, gyda addysg Cymraeg yn ffynnu yn y de, ond mae ond rhaid edrych ar map OS o gwylod y sir a map OS o gogledd y sir i weld y cyferbyniad ieithyddol yna wedi adlewyrchu yn enwau ffermydd, yn trefi, nodweddion yn y tirlun. Felly mae'n sir ardal diddorol iawn o safbwynt yr iaith. Sleid nesaf, please. Nawr, un peth sydd wedi newid yn 28 mlynedd ers fi fod yn y swydd yw'r ffordd mae awdurdod y parc yn ymdrin ar iaith. Yn sicr dwi wedi gweld newid positif gyda polisi yn dod mewn ar sail gwaith Llywodraeth Cymru sydd wedi trawsnewid agwedd yr awdurdod tuag at yr iaith a hynny mewn ffordd positif iawn. Dwi yn gallu cofio yn anffodus agweddaeth anygyddol tuag at yr iaith gan nifer o staff di-Gymraeg pan dechreuais i yn y swydd nôl yn y 90au. A braf gweud bod hynny ddim yn wir nawr. Mae'r text sydd ar eich sgrin yn dod o'r hwb Cymraeg newydd sydd wedi cael ei creu i staff, achos na siwt gwmynt o staff gyda ni nawr sydd yn dysgu'r iaith, a mae hwnna'n peth ffantastig i weld. Bydde dim gobeith bod rhywbeth fel na wedi cael ei greu rhyw 30 mlynedd nôl, dim o gwbl. Yn y text sydd ar y sgrin, dwi'n hoff iawn o'r darn ble mae'r iaith yn cael ei alw'n un o drysorau Cymru. Dwi'n meddwl Carwyn wedi cyfeirio at ieithoedd fel drysorau. Dwi'n cytuno gyda hwnna 100%. E-bost ac oni bai, mae fe yn un o drysorau Cymru. A yn yr un modd i fi, mae cael y cyfoeth o bioamrywiaeth na, mae hwnna'n cyfoethogi yn bywydau ni. Byddwn ni yn dadlau'n gryf bod cyfoeth diwylliannol ac ieithyddol hefyd yn cyfoethogi yn bywydau. A os ych chi'n gweld y gwerth mewn warchod cynefinodd neu gwarchod rhywogaethau penodol, mae'n naturiol i fi y byddwch chi'n gweld y gwerth mewn gwarchod ieithoedd a diwylliannau. Mae'r byd yn lle tlotach yn diwedd gyda pob creadur neu planhigyn i ni'n colli, a mae'r byd hefyd yn lle tlotach os ni'n colli ieithoedd a diwylliannau gwahanol. Mae'r ddoi beth yn cyfoethogi cymunedau a'n bywydau. Felly braf i'w gweld agwedd lot mwy positif tuag at yr iaith ymysg staff sydd gyda ni lawr fan hyn yn Parc Sir Benfro, yn enwedig gan bod yr ardal yn un ieithyddol mor wahanol o gogledd i gwylod y sir. Sleid nesaf, please. Felly, mlaen i swydd fi yn benodol fel ranger. Nawr, mae rôl y ranger a beth mae hwnna'n golygu o ran gwaith ddydd i ddydd yn amrywio'n fawr o fudiad i fudiad a hyd yn oed o un parc cenedlaethol i barc arall. Ond lawr fan hyn yn Sir Benfro, mae rôl o biti gweithio gyda pobl. Felly fel rhan o fy swydd, dwi'n gweithio'n rheolaidd gyda gwirfoddolwyr yn gwneud gwaith cadwraeth ar ran y tîm cadwraeth ac ar llwybrau. Dwi'n mynd mas a ysgolion ar tripiau, dwi'n mynd mewn i ysgolion i siarad. Dwi'n cysylltu gyda grwpiau cymunedol, dwi'n gwneud sgyrsiau fi nos, arwenteithiau cerdded, gweld perchnogion tir, a ceisio yw'r gair fan hyn, dylanwadu ar y ffordd mae pobl yn ymddwyn pan maen nhw'n ymweld yr ardal, i ceisio sicrhau bod nhw ddim yn cael effaith negyddol. Ond fel rhan o bopeth dwi'n neud, a pe bydde rhywun yn gofyn i fi am un brawddeg byr i esbonio beth yn gwmws mae'r swydd o biti, bydden ni'n gweud bod fi'n ceisio ysgogi diddordeb, chwilfrydedd ac angerdd am tirlun a bywyd gwyllt y Parc Cenedlaethol yn y pobl dwi'n cwrdd â. Dwi ddim yn gweud bod fi'n llwyddo, neu na, gyda pobl o bell ffordd, ond yn sicr na beth fi'n treial gwneud, achos drwy gwneud hynny, wrth gwrs y gobeith yw bydd pobl moyn gweld y lle yn cael ei warchod, gymaint a dwi moyn gweld y lle yn cael ei warchod. Nawr, wrth gwrs, mae lot o wahanol ffyrdd o geisio meithrin y teimladau yna am pobl, boed dangos golygfa hudolus iddyn nhw, tynnu nhw mewn i helpu gwella cynefinodd, fel bod nhw'n gweld y gwerth a ymddiddori yn bywyd gwyllt, rhoi profiadau cofiadwy iddyn nhw'n yr awyr agored ac yn y blaen. Ond i fi, mae cysylltu pobl gyda'r iaith, hefyd gyda'r rôl I ware yn neud na, yn meithrin y teimladau cryf na. Felly beth dwi'n mynd I neud nawr yw just siario cwpl o siamplau o fy ngwaith ble mae'r iaith Gymraeg wedi neu yn chwarae rôl blaen llaw wrth ymgysylltu â phobl. Sleid nesaf, please, Christy. Felly yn gynta, nôl yn 2020 pan glaniodd y sefyllfa Covid ofnadw na'r pen yn I gyd, Wen I gyd dwi'n siŵr yn chwilio am ffyrdd o gadw mewn cysylltiad gyda staff, ond hefyd gyda gwirfoddolwyr. Felly, bu o'n i'n ffodus blynyddoedd nôl I gael Eleanor lawr I wneud cwrs Cymraeg yn y tirlun. Felly cymeres I beth nath Eleanor a symleiddio fe reit lawr. Dwi ddim dar gallu sydd gyda Eleanor, ond cyniges I wneud sgwrs syml ar Gymraeg yn y tirlun, gyda'r bwriad o esbonio ystyr rai o'r geiriau Cymraeg sydd i'w gweld tro ar ôl tro yn y gogledd y sir, boed hynny'n enwau llefydd, enwau ffermydd, neu nodweddion yn y tirlun, a wedyn rhoi siamplau o'r lleol o'r geiriau yna, a siarad y bytu'r llefydd, ac yn olaf, rhoi elfen o help I bobl I ddeall sut I weid y geiriau yna yn gywir. Felly oedd hwn wedi'n nelu at staff, ond yn bennaf at gwirfoddolwyr, di Gymraeg neu dysgwyr. Wen I bach yn amheus, mae rhaid I weid, beth I siwt bydde fe'n mynd. Chymod, dwi ddim yn ieithydd fel Carwyn, crafus I yn Cymraeg lefel o fi. Fi bydde'r cyntaf I weid bod treiglo fi bach yn amheus. Ond fi jyst yn brwdfrydig iawn o beth i'r iaith a ceisio siario hwnna gyda pobl. A'n credu gyda bach o'r weiniad ac ymdrech gall pawb hefyd wneud ymges cywir o dda I weid geiriau Cymraeg yn gywir hefyd. Sleid nesa, Christy. Felly dechreuais I gyda sleid ma, jyst yn esbonio bod wyddor gwahanol gyda ni'n Gymraeg ac yn edrych ar y synnau mae'r llyfariad yn neud a'r effaith mae rhoi tŵ bach yn cael ar nhw. Mae lot o gwirfoddolwyr ni o gwylod y sir, pobl sydd wedi ymddeol, ond felly sydd ddim wedi derbyn dim addysg y bytu'r Gymraeg o gwbl pan maen nhw yn yr ysgol, nôl pan maen nhw'n ifanc. A hefyd mae lot o gwirfoddolwyr ni yn pobl sydd wedi symud i'r ardal, wedi ymddeol o Loegr. A beth oedd yn... Wel, treulio ni tipyn amser ar y sleid, mae lot fwy na wen i'n disgwyl, a fod yn onest. A ges i'n syni mewn ffordd really dda, really positif, faint o awch oedd mas na I ddeall yr iaith bach yn fwy, a cyn lleied oedd rhai pobl wedi cael y cyfle, os nag nhw'n dysgu'r iaith, I ddeall pethau fel bod wyddor gwahanol gyda ni. Sleid nesaf, please. A es I mlaen wedyn, just I fynd trwy cyfres o eir, rhyw 20 gair dwi'n credu oedd da fi, oedd sleids gyda fi fel un, rhyw 4 gair ar pob sleid, a chi'n gweld rhai'r geiriau piges I fyna, a rhai eraill oedd, chymod, rhai mawr, aber, llan, carn, pont, rhyd. Chymod, geiriau sy'n gyffredin iawn dros Gymru gyfan, dim ond yn lleol. A esbonio beth oedd I ystyr nhw, a siwt I gweud nhw'n gywir, a beth oedd yn hyfryd ac yn galonogol dros ben, oedd faint mor positif oedd yr ymateb, a'r nifel o bobl weles I wedyn ar ôl I ni gylled dod mas o'r cyfnod clo. Gweld pobl misiodd ar ôl ni, ar ôl wneud y sgwrs, faint wen nhw'n gweud faint mor defnyddiol o'n I wedi ffindo fe, faint mor ddiddorol. A felly oedd wedi profi fi bod diddordeb cryf yn yr iaith yn bodoli ymysg pobl sydd yn byw yn lleol, ond sydd ddim yn ei siarad e. A ers ni, dwi wedi gwneud y cwpl o weithiau ers ni, a mae rai fi wedi bod fi yn cael boddhad mawr o wneud y sgwrs yma a gweld yr ymateb ymysg pobl. Sleid nesaf, please, Christy. A wedyn fel rhan o'r swydd, dwi'n lwcus iawn bod cysylltiadau agos gyda ni yn y gogledd gyda'n ysgolion lleol. Nawr mae hwnna'n eitha rwydd, 2 ysgol sydd da ni yn y parc cenedlaethol, lan fan hyn, a mae byti wych gyda ni rownd y ffin. Felly dyma sleid o Cwm Gwein. A ges i'n cysylltu gan y pennaeth yn ysgol y Cwm, a mae hi hefyd yn pennaeth yr ysgol Cysma. Moyn trafod edrych ar creu prosiect bach o amgylch edrych ar enwau percy yn yr ardal. Sleid nesaf, please. Nawr, mae'r pennaeth yma yn eitha glew ar y teg iddi am taflu rhyw prosiect ydi gili a cael bach o arian grant. Felly, steddon ni lawr gyda'r athrawon o'r ddoi ysgol a cynghorydd o'r cyngor cymuned i weld a gallwn ni dynnu prosiect bach at ei gili. A dethon ni lan ar prosiect mae percy ni gyda'r bwriad bod y plant yn y ddoi ysgol yn dysgu am ei ardal lleol drwy dysgu am enwau'r percy yn yr ardal a beth o'n nhw'n gallu tynnu hwnna o ran hanes yr ardal. Sleid nesaf, please. Felly, yn y bôn, bydd y plant yn edrych ar mapiau degwm ar wefan y Llyfrgell Genedlaethol, edrych ar ystyr y geiriau oedd hwnna'n taflu lan a beth oedd hwnna'n rhai o'r enwau'r percy mae'n gweud wrthyn nhw beth i hanes yr ardal yn y gorffennol, wedd map hyfryd hwn wedi cael ei greu a taflen gwybodaeth. Bydd yr ysgolion ar drip lan i'r Llyfrgell yn Aberystwyth. Ond wedyn rhan fi o'r prosiect oedd mynd ar plant mas am cwpl o deithiau cerdded yn yr ardal, galw mewn cwpl o ffermydd i siarad am yr enwau'r y percy o amgylch y ffarm penodol na. A wrth gwrs beth oedd yn diddorol oedd bod gwahanol enwau nawr o lot fawr o'r percy na beth wedd y plant wedi ffindo ar y mapiau degwm. Ac oedd hyn wedyn yn sbarduno sgyrsiau o amgylch sut wedd defnydd o tir wedi newid dros amser, sut bydde newid falle mewn tenant a rhyw ffarm neu perchenog yn golygu falle bod enwau newydd yn cael ei defnyddio rai percy. A wedyn hefyd oedd y ffaith bod rai o'r percy bach wedi cael ei bwrw mewn un parc mawr, ac oedd hwn wedyn arwen at trafodaethau am dulliau modern o ffermio o gymaru gyda'r gorffennol, a'r gwahaniaeth o tynnu cloddiau mas yn gwneud i'r tirlun ac hefyd i bywyd gwell. Felly oedd e'n testyn, oedd wedi agor lan modd i edrych ar yr ardal mewn ffordd lot yn fwy na just yr hanes. Oedd e'n dod mewn a gweddau pethau eraill. Sleid nesaf. A diwedd y prosiect wedyn, wedd bod y plant wedi cynhyrchu, arlunio arwyddion a fel rhan o'r arian grant oedd modd argraffu rein wedyn ar borden trwchus a job fi oedd rithro rownd yr ardal yn rhoi rein lan ar y percy cywir, tipyn o job, mae rhaid i weid, matio'r arwydd gyda'r parc. A nawr ni'n gwybod bod rhaid yn mynd i para am sbel hir iawn mas fyna ar y tir, ond mae e'n eitha neis am y tro i weld yr arwyddio yma mynd yn co trwy'r ardal a tôn testyn siarad i bobl, neu os mae ymwelwyr yn gweld nhw, mae'r QR code bach na ar y gwylod, mae modd mynd i wefan i darllen bach yn fwy byti fe. A just wrth bod fi'n edrych ar hwnna, mae eisiau clau arwydd parc fel yn lifio'n desperate, am ysau, byddai fi'n neud hwnna rhywbryd. Sleid nesaf, please. Nawr, rwy'n siŵr bod lot fawr ohonych chi yn ymwybodol o'r llyfr The Lost Words. Mae mae'n llyfr hyfryd os na chi'n gwybod beth yw o darluniau o bywyd gwyllt a wedyn darn o farddoniaeth. Mae fersiwn Cymraeg wedi cael ei greu am y cerddi gan Mererid Hopwood. Ond wedd y llyfr yma wreiddiol The Lost Words, oedd yr awdur ar lunydd wedi cael sbarduno i greu y llyfr yma mewn ymateb i'r ffaith bod yr Oxford Junior Dictionary yn tynnu mas nifer o eiriau yn bywyd gwyllt o'r geiriadur oherwydd bod plant jyst ddim yn defnyddio nhw ragor. A dim o reidrwydd pethau pryn, byddech chi ddim yn gweld llawer, ond pethau fel dant y llew, dridwy, clychu'r gog. A mae fe yn amlwg wrth weithio gyda ysgolion bod y geirfa am blanhigion, cod, adar ac yn y blaen yn lleihau. Ac o'n ymhrofiad i, bydden ni'n gweud bod yr eirfa mae pethau ma'n y Gymraeg bach yn wannach hyd yn oed na yn y Saesneg. A dwi ddim yn gweud hwn mewn ffordd beirniadol o gwbl. Mae fe jyst y sefyllfa i ni nawr yn ac yn adlewyrchu ble ni fel cymdeithas o ran pobl yn treulio llai amser mas tu fas, a falle ddim ar cysylltiadau agos na gyda bywyd gwyllt. Felly, mewn ffordd i helpu hwn, mewn tymed ffordd bach. Dros y blynydde dwi wedi mynd ati i greu adnoddau syml iawn, rhestr dwyieithog o enwau pryfed, cod, creaduriau Glan Môr ac yn y blaen. Fel bod fi'n gallu rhoi nhw i athrawon os ydyn ni wedi bod mas yn trochi yn y pyllau Glan Môr, bod fi'n gallu rhoi rhestr dwyieithog o enwau mewn creaduriau ni wedi dod ar draws, yr un peth am cod. Dwi'n mynd mewn i ysgolion lot i chwilota yn y tir yr ysgol am pryfed ac yn y blaen. A dwi'n ffindo bod athrawon yn ddiolchgar iawn am unrhyw adnoddau i ni fel pobl sy'n gweithio yn y sector yma yn gallu roi iddyn nhw i helpu nhw i fynd i'r afel a dysgu thema i byd naturiol yma. Dwi'n credu bod lle ni gyd i ceisio gwneud hynna. Y sleid nesaf. A esiampl bach arall fan hyn o ryw quiz cysylltu'r enwau gyda'r lluniau o Pili Palod beth sy'n mynd rownd i roi o'r sioe amaethyddol lleol. A mater bach yw creu adnoddau bach fel hyn, ond to mae fe jyst yn help i cadw'r enwau na a'r geirfa na i fynd. Sleid nesaf, please, Christy. A yn yr un modd, dwi'n mynd adnoddau syml dwyieithog gyda fi ar deithio cerdded Cymraeg i siario gyda pobl, to os maen nhw moyn, sy'n fforso unrhyw beth ar pobl. Ond enghraifft fan hyn o rhestr enwau blodau gyffredin y sir, a mae rhestr tebyg dy fi o enwau adar y môr. A fel nhw'n gweud, dwi yn teimlo'n gryf bod rôl gyda ni gyd yn y sector yma, os ydyn ni'n galled i defnyddio'r enwau Cymraeg am blanhigion adar, anifeiliaid ac ati, ochr yn ochr a'r enwau Saesneg, fel bod mwy o'r eiriau yma ddim yn mynd fel yn ddiarth i bobl. Sleid nesaf, please. A un esiampl bach arall fan hyn, rhan o daflen nes i cynhyrchu am wac i ddysgwyr a'r un ma gyda lluniau hefyd o'r blodau when nhw'n mynd i weld ar y daith gyda'r enwau yn ddwyieithog. Sleid nesaf, please. Ac yn olaf wedyn, un o'r perks mawr y swydd yma yw cael arwen teithio cerdded. Gyda fy hoff rei yn bersonol a'r mynydd Preseli, deall yn iawn Carwyn, beth ydych chi'n gweud gan arach y beth i mynydd. Dwi'n siŵr bod lot o pobl ar yr alwad mawr gogledd yn gweud, Carol, yw'n mynydd yw hwnna. Ond mynydd yw ein i lawr ffryn, mynydd Preseli. A pan dwi'n arwen y teithio cerdded yma, dwi'n siarad yn amlwg beth i hanes y Parc Cenedlaethol, dwi'n siarad beth i pwysigrwydd yr ardal o safbwynt cadwraeth, sut mae ffermwyr yn defnyddio'r comin. Chymod yr holl stwff da yna, ond fy hoff beth yw siarad am yr enwau sydd wedi cael ei roi ar darnau o'r tirlun, a esbonio ble dwi'n gallu ystyr enwau, a sut maen nhw'n helpu ni i ddeall mwy o beth yw'r tir ar ardal. Dwi'n siŵr beth i ni gyd yn ceisio gwneud pan ni'n cyfathrebu gyda pobl, yw cymryd pobl tu hwnt i jyst edmygu'r olygfa, yn dyfeu gysylltu bach yn ddyfnach gyda'r tirlun ar ardal, achos yn mynd nôl i beth wedes i'r dechrau, gobeith yw meithrin y chwilfrydedd a'r angerdd na i ni'n teimlo yn pobl eraill tuag at y lle. A mae rhaid fi weid bod pobl wastod yn ymateb ac yn ymddiddori yn yr agwedd yma am y trafodaethau hir yn deillio mas o siarad am y tirlun. Felly jyst y 4 dwi wedi rhoi lan ar y sgrin fyna nawr. Di'r geiriau wedi dod lan. So cors tewgyll. Mae pob un o'r ein yn gweud rhywbeth i chi am yr ardal diwedd. So mae patchyn grigog, mae hwnna'n disgrifio beth sy'n tyfu na, mae'n ardal llawn o grig. Mae cors tewgyll, mae hwnna'n disgrifio ansawdd y pridd, y tir, y ffaith bod e'n tir gwlyb. Mae restr gerig wedyn yn cyfeirio at nodwedd daearegol. Y man lle bydd y rhewlydd yn dod off y tir uchel a wedi gadael y cerig yn y pwynt isiel fyna o dan. A un ffefryn fi wedyn yw Cerrig Marchogion. Mae Cerrig Marchogion yn ardal o gerrig ar wasgar ar draws rhan o'r mynnu, ond mae'n cyfeirio at marchogion yn gysylltiedig gyda stori Culhwch ac Olwen, a'r marchogion yn hela'r twrch trwyth trwy'r ardal. A mae'r ffaith i fi bod modd cyflwyno i bobl rhan pwysig o diwylliant ni fel Cymru, sef ein storïau fel Culhwch ac Olwen a'r Mabinogi, trwy nodwedd fel Anna Tirlun. Mae hwnna jyst yn arbennig, a mae'r sylwadau dwi'n cael nôl wrth pobl wastad yn cyfeirio faint maen nhw wedi mwynhau ochr nawr daith cerdded a beth maen nhw wedi clywed. Sleid nesaf. A felly dwi'n mynd i pennu fyna gyda rhan o gerdd Preseli gan Waldo Williams ar y sgrin. A jyst yn annog chi gyd, pinau i chi'n siarad Cymraeg, ddim yn siarad Cymraeg, wedi byw yn Gymru eriod, neu wedi symud i fyw yma dwe, jyst i ymddiddori a gwerthfawrogi'r iaith, achos dwi'n hyderus bydd gwneud hynny yn cyfoethogi'r gwaith i chi wneud, pwy bynnag fath o rôl sydd gyda chi yn y maes hyn, ond hefyd dwi'n teimlo bydd e'n helpu chi i feithrin diddordeb yn y gwaith i chi'n gwneud ymysg cymunedau lleol, ond hefyd ymwelwyr. Sleid nesaf. Felly diolch yn fawr i chi am wrando.
Gwych, diolch yn fawr i ti, Carol. Mae jyst mor hyfryd clywed am yr holl weithgareddau gwahanol yma sydd yn digwydd ar lawr gwlad. Yn waith arbennig yn mynd ymlaen yn Ngogledd Sir Benfro. Reit, mae gennym ni 8 munud ar ôl bobl o'r sesiwn hon. Felly, gai weld ar lan y cwestiynau, gan i weld beth sydd gyda ni. Iawn. Ni ddechrau efo cwestiynau penodol i ti, Caro, felly, a wedyn agor allan i weld os yna ambell gwestiwn arall allan ni gymryd o fewn yr amser sydd ar ôl. Reit, oedd Laura Gynnefach yn gofyn am y cyrsiau Cymraeg yn y dirwedd. Mae rhain y si sôn amdano nhw yn bethau gafodd i treialu mewn ffordd, yn enwedig yr un yn Sir Benfro. Wyt ti, Carol, yn dal i gynnal cyrsiau Cymraeg yn y dirwedd yn Sir Benfro?
Wel, beth dwi wedi wneud oedd e'n sgwrs mwy na cwrs. A dwi wedi wneud cwpl o weithiau i wahanol grwpiau o fewn yr ardal, ond dwi ddim yn rhywbeth dwi wedi agor mas, chymod, ymhellach na hynny. Mae un fi, byddwn ni ddim yn gweud bod un fi yn cwrs o bell ffordd, rhyw awr anner, chymod, o sgwrs eitha syml, ond dwi yn, o'r ymateb dwi wedi cael yn lleol, mae fe'n amlwg bod y diddordeb na, yn sicr. Mae wir diddordeb yn y peth mae pe bydde rhywun moyn pigo fel anaredig dyge. Chymod, p'un mae eisiau teilwra fe i wahanol ardalodd, ond fel yn gweud, mae lot o'r geiriau wedi ni'n cyfro, maen nhw'n berthnasol i bob ardal o Gymru.
Mae hwnna rhywbeth felly sy'n eisiau rhoi ar restr siopa bod eisiau cynnal mwy o'r cyrsiau yma, ledled Cymru, a'i cynnal nhw yn gyson. Os yw Laura eisiau cysylltu gyda tîm natur am byth, allai ymchwilio i weld os oes yna ragor o gyrsiau yn cael eu cynnal mewn llefydd eraill yng Nghymru ar hyn o bryd. Dwi'n hapus i wneud hynny. Mae yna gwestiwn wedi dod gan Richard Edwards. What is it about Welsh that encapsulates greater meaning rather than English of place?
Dwi'n meddwl bod hyn i fi. Yn fras, mae hyn i'n ei gyda hanes y ddwy iaith, a hefyd un o'r pethau yna does dim modd ei hesbonio, sef jyst y ffurf mae gwahanol ieithoedd yn disgrifio y byd. Yn aml, ddim yn ddieithiad o bell ffordd, ond yn aml mae enwau lle yn y Saesneg, fel yn y Ffrangeg, yn dibynnu ar enw unigolyn. So cymwch Birmingham, er enghraifft. Ham, hen air o Saesneg sydd wedi marw erbyn hyn, yn golygu treflan neu anedd neu rhywbeth. ing, pobl a dyn oedd hynny. Ac os ydych chi'n edrych ar llawer iawn o enwau lle yn Saesneg, maen nhw'n dilyn y patrwm yna, maen nhw'n deillio o unigolyn, arweinydd neu beth bynnag. Ond dyw hwnna ddim yn wir yn ddieithriad. Y peth arall yw bod llawer o'r enwau Saesneg sydd yn reiddiol yn ddisgrifiadol, roedden nhw'n ddisgrifiadol yn yr hen Saesneg, ond bod yr iaith Saesneg wedi newid, a wedyn does dim modd deall ystyr yr enw, jyst o edrych ar yr enw gyda lens Saesneg modern. Yn y Gymraeg, a does dim digon o ddogfennaeth i wybod i alluolrhain yr holl fanylion yma, ond i ryw raddau mae'r iaith ysgrifenedig o leia wedi newid llai dros y 1000 o flynyddoedd diwetha yn yr Saesneg, mae hynny yn wir. A mae'n bosib hefyd, a fel fi'n gweud, does dim digon o dystiolaeth, ond mae'n bosib hefyd bod rhai o'r enwau lle maen nhw wedi newid gyda'r iaith. Mae Ffrainc yn neud hyd yn gliriach na Saesneg. Yn Ffrainc mae llawer iawn o'r enwau lle mi oedden nhw'n neud sens fel petai yn y Lladin, ond oedd i Lladin newid i Hen Ffrangeg, a Hen Ffrangeg newid i Ffrangeg canol a Ffrangeg modern. Erbyn hyn, dim ond gair yw yn hytrach na bod chi'n gallu gweld fel gyda enwau Cymraeg, chi'n gallu torri nhw lawr mewn i'w gwahanol rhannau y gair. So bron bob un o'r enwau oedd gyda Carol ar y map, neu bron unrhyw bentre yng Nghymru, y mwyafrif llethol, mi allwch chi edrych ar y gair a dweud, dyna ystyr yr enw. Nid felly yn aml iawn yn Saesneg neu Ffrangeg. Hanes iaith yn newid yw hynny yn y bôn.
Iawn, ni'n bryn iawn o amser, ond dwi'n ymwybodol bod yr darn ola yma o'r sesiwn fod i trio adnabod camau nesaf. A wedyn ni'n meddwl, reit, licen ni trio gofyn rhywbeth i chi'ch dau. Mae yna sylwad eraill a chwestiynau eraill am enwau yn Gymraeg a rywogaethau rhai doniol ag ati, ond ddrwg gen i di am adael hynna. Dwi eisiau holi Carwyn a Carol. So gennych chi restr siopa nawr o bethau hoffech chi weld yn digwydd. I gynyddu'r math o bethau ni wedi bod yn trafod heno. Beth fydde ar dop eich rhestr siopa chi? O ran y sector amgylcheddol, na i gynnig un i gychwyn, licen ni weld swyddogion treftadaeth iaith ym mhob corff amgylcheddol, yr sector gyhoeddus a'r trydydd sector, ledled Cymru, achos gobeithio bod sesiwn heno wedi dangos pa mor fawr yw'r pwnc, pa mor ddamdyr, pa mor bwysig yw a sut mae iaith yn plethu efo'r amgylchedd. A mae'n golygu llawer mwy na chyfieithu, pwysiced yw hynny mewn cyrff amgylcheddol. Felly dyna fydde ar dop y rhestr siopa i, swyddogion treftadaeth iaith ym mhob corff amgylcheddol yn gyrru'r math yma o weithgareddau amrywiol yn ei blaenau. Felly un gan y ddau ohonych chi, Carol a Carwyn.
Wel fe a i am yr adnoddau syml yma i ysgolion ac yn y blaen. Ni'n colli geirfa, yn enwedig ymysg y to ifanc, dwi'n gweld lot o athrawon, mae'r athrawon hen yn gred, mae'r athrawon mwy ifanc, dwi'n gweld bod y geirfa ddim gyda nhw, a'n aml, mae rhaid nhw i ni wylo bob man am adnoddau, wedyn falle bod yr adnoddau yna, mae mwy o ymdrech wedi cael ei wneud i hala nhw i edrych yn ffansi na jyst wneud nhw yn ddefnyddiol, chymod. A felly dwi'n meddwl os ni'n gallu helpu athrawon, mae'r awch mas na, mae lot fwy nawr o waith yn mynd mewn o ran cael ysgolion mas, annog ysgolion i ddefnyddio'r awyr agored yn ei themau ac yn y blaen. Yn ni fel Parc Cenedlaethol, dwi'n mynd mas o ysgol, es i am mas o ysgol wythnos diwetha, dwi'n mynd mas o ysgol wythnos nesaf. Mae ysgolion a want i fynd mas i'r awyr agored, a dwi'n meddwl mae eisiau ni fel mudiadau a pobl sy'n gweithio yn y sector yn rhaid i wneud popeth yn gallu i helpu'r athrawon yna, achos falle ddim na i, falle bod nhw wedi dod o'r cefndir hanes neu cerdd neu beth bynnag, i helpu nhw gyda adnoddau syml, geirfa ac yn y blaen, a pyd o'n meddwl gormod y byti bod pobl yn gofod edrych yn ffansi, sy'n rhaid i pethau mae'n costi lot o arian. Dwi'n whipo mas stwff, just yn unan, taflen dwyieithog, gret, just the job, na gys i isio arnyn nhw. A cael y pethau yma wedyn mas i ysgolion i helpu'r athrawon i ddysgu'r... Achos mae cenedlaeth nesaf, mae'r plant yn dwlu. Chymod, ewch chi a plant i trochi yn y pylle dŵr, ewch chi a nhw i wylo yn pryfed. Mae plant yn dwlu ar y pethau yma, wedyn mae'n just helpu ar athrawon bod y geirfa yna, bod ni ddim yn colli mwy o'r eiriau yma, dife, o defnydd plant sy'n dod lan nawr, bod nhw ddim yn gwybod beth yw beth.
Reit, o Carol. Carwyn, dy un syniad di?
O'n i'n mynd i weid yn union yr un peth â Carol. Gwir pob gair. Plant yw'r allwedd fan hyn, dwi'n meddwl. A falle jyst i ategu, mae reality cymdeithasol, hynny yw, dwi ganol yn 30au, dwi ddim mewn oedran, ond mi dyfes i lan yn chwarae ar yr hewl. Pan oedd y tywydd yn ffein, o'n i'n chwarae mas ar yr hewl, ac oedd hynny'n dod â ni mewn cysylltiad gyda byd natur a bob math o bethau yn naturiol iawn. A fi'n gwybod hynny'n wir y llawer iawn o bobl trefol neu wledig yng nghenedlaeth i ac yn hun. Ond mae hwnna wedi newid yn ddirfawr ac ychydig iawn o blant sydd allan dyddiau hyn. Newid cymdeithasol, allech chi weld yr ystadegau am hyn. Falle bod e'n ddiog, ond o'n i wir yn mynd i ddweud beth wedodd Carol. A mae'r cwricwlwm i Gymru wedi nodi bod hyn yn ddehead, yn ddymuniad, os hoffech chi, bod hyn yn rhan o addysg plant yng Nghymru, ond o leia o beth dwi'n ymwneud cryn dipyn gyda ysgolion yn Sir Gar, a mae yna awydd i wneud, fel Carol yn gweud, ond dwi ddim yn gwybod, dwi'n gwybod eto os ydyn ni wedi gweld y dehead yna wir yn cael ei gyflawni, a dwi'n meddwl bod ni'n eto tipyn o'r ffordd bod pob plentyn yn ystod ei hamser cynradd man lleia wir yn cael y cyfle i ddysgu'r pethau hyn, dysgu am eu cynefin, dysgu'r geiriau, dod i adnabod, bod yn gyffyrddus allan y mas, chymod, yng nghanol y coed ac yn y blaen, a'r ceia ac yn y blaen. Y plant.
Reit o, rewn ni symud ymlaen i'r sleid nesaf, Christy. Are we hopping over, Christy, the survey? So thanking the speakers and also thanking our translator. Diolch i ti hefyd am yn helpu ni heno. Dwi'n meddwl falle nad oes na amser i wneud yr arolwg sydyn gyda ymddiheuriadau am y cychwyniad ychydig yn herciog efo trio gweithio yn y ddwy iaith. Ond y peth pwysig yw bod ni wedi cael clywed sgyrsiau bendigedig Carol a Carwyn, a gobeithio bod pawb wedi mwynhau a wedi cael cyfle i feddwl falle ychydig yn ehangach ac yn ddyfnach am y pwnc hwn sy'n diddori ni'n tri ar y panel heno yn sicr, a dwi'n siŵr bod yr un peth yn wir am nifer fawr o'r bobl sydd wedi ymuno ni heno. Felly, diolch o galon i chi, a chofiwch bod na ddwy webinar arall dyma rhannu'r barn. Reit, os oes gan bobl funud i lenwi'r holiadur yma, dio ddim yn mynd i gymryd mwy na munud, a os allech chi rannu eich sylwadau gyda ni, bydde tîm natur am byth yn gwerthfawrogi. Dwi'n meddwl, fel dwi'n deall, mae'r arolwg yn mynd i ymddangos ar y platfform nawr. Dwi'n gobeithio bod hwnna wedi gweithio, achos dyn ni ar y pen yma ddim yn gallu gweld unrhyw beth yn digwydd. Felly, Christy, shall we move on to the next slide? Lovely. Felly, cofiwch, mae yna 2 webinar i ddod eto. Cynta ar y 19 o Chwefror yn dathlu cynhwysiant LHDT+, a'r un ola wedyn ar y 19 o Fawrth yn dathlu niwroamrywiaeth. A bydd croeso mawr i chi gyd yma heno i ymuno gyda'r sesiynau hynny. Felly diolch o galon i chi gyd am ymuno ni heno. I ni wedi mwynhau, a wedi mwynhau gweld y sylwadau a'r cwestiynau sydd wedi dod i fewn hefyd. Diolch yn fawr i chi amdanyn nhw. Noswaith dda i bawb.